Let's put our cards on the table. We're not satisfied with present conditions. In this country and throughout the world there is widespread discontent, fears, insecurity, and unnecessary privation. One crisis is followed by another. On the one hand, vast quantities of essential goods are going to waste. On the other, half the world's population is hungry. Those words were written in 1935 by R.A. Cantillon in introducing a series of lessons on social credit. Let us take a brief look to the conditions of that time in Alberta, known as the Hungry 30s. The economic condition of restriction of financial credit to business, industry, and agriculture, which brought about the fall of the stock market in 1929, caused massive unemployment and suffering. Young men by the thousands traveled across the country, riding the boxcars, hoping somewhere to find employment. There was none. Soup kitchens were set up in all the major centers. People on farms and in villages and hamlets provided a meal or a sandwich when any of these destitute men came to their doors. To add to the hardships caused by the economic depression came the drought. Dust storms blocked out the sun, shifting the topsoil so that what had been good soil became sand dunes, burying fences, roads, and machinery. With no rain there were no crops, and with the lowest prices ever for all farm products, even in areas not hit by the drought, grain at 20 cents a bushel was the lowest in 400 years. There was no money to buy food, either for people or animals. Farmers lined up at elevators where relief supplies were brought in from the east and distributed: apples, dry salt cod, beans, baled hay, etc. Many, with their wells dry, packed up their families and left home, headed northwest, hoping for better conditions elsewhere. Whereas most had to depend on the horse and wagon, a few were able to make enough for travel by car, but went without footwear or skimped otherwise to do so. For a majority of the people with no money for food, let alone gas, cars were restructured to be horse-drawn and dubbed Bennett buggies after the Prime Minister of the day, the Honourable R.B. Bennett. Some cars were even converted for field work. Angry crowds gathered to protest the government's lack of effective action. As always in any drought comes pestilence. Grasshoppers and armyworms only added to the difficulties and miseries people had to face. What the lack of moisture didn't wipe out, these two did. They moved en masse, consuming everything in their path, including the exterior of buildings. Carefully tended gardens, the one source of homegrown vegetables, fell prey to these grasshoppers, cutworms, and wireworms. Gophers were prolific and destructive. When there was crops, they grew fat on unsaleable grain lying in the fields, and destroyed what was left by the grasshoppers in the drought areas. A bounty of 6 cents per tael was paid by the government in an effort to control them. In some starvation situations, gophers became the meat supply. What to do? Where would the people of Alberta turn to find a solution to this desperate situation? Mr. William Aberhart, a Calgary High School principal and religious broadcaster, took up the challenge. The solution was social credit. Mr. Aberhart conveyed a message of hope in his informative and encouraging broadcasts. People listened. Those without radios joined in with those who did. Ingenuity came to the fore, and party lines were used to tune into the broadcasts from one home to the other. Said Mr. Aberhart, quote, "For more than 20 years the debt problem has been the curse of this country. It has been responsible for more blighted lives and shattered homes than any single cause of our harrowing distresses. Debt has hung like a nightmare over our farmers, constantly threatening them with the dispossession of their farms and loss of their equities. It has become an ever-growing incubus to industries, sucking the very lifeblood out of them. In fact, there are few homes throughout the country into which the clammy tentacles of the octopus we call debt has not found their way, draining the economic security of the family and enslaving them to the fear of losing all their possessions. I ask you, is that not a subject for consideration? We have a wonderful province, said Mr. Aberhart. We have coal in abundance and virile, energetic people who are willing to produce. The province is not bankrupt. It is as rich as ever in natural resources. What we lack is money. We need a scientific money system that will enable us to produce and distribute the wealth we have. I want you to help me do something about it. Will you do that? In the summer of 1933, Mr. Aberhart and Ernest Manning undertook a major province-wide tour. They traveled 5 days a week, speaking in every conceivable situation. The impact was overwhelming. As a result of Mr. Aberhart's broadcasts and speeches, grassroots movements sprang up which first saw the formation of social credit study groups, and then the founding of the Social Credit League in 1934. The League became the vehicle for political action leading up to the election of 1935. By that time, more than 2,000 social credit study groups blanketed the province. Many of these were organized by Mrs. Edith Rogers, who, among others, toured the province in 1934. Premier R.G. Reid called a general election for the summer of 1935. The election date, as recorded in the Edmonton Journal, was set for August 22nd. Some 300,000 Albertans would be eligible to vote. An Edmonton Journal news item of July 15, 1935 reported, quote, 2 years of organization was crowned here Tuesday in the eyes of supporters of the Alberta Social Credit League, after William Aberhart, founder of the organization, took it on its first plunge into provincial politics, announcing candidates for the new party to contest all 63 seats. All candidates used the same basic campaign poster, with the main slogans being, "End poverty in the midst of plenty," and "Your support can elect a good, clean, honest government." On Election Day, people turned out in unprecedented numbers. 301,752 compared with 182,219 in the previous election of 1930. In fact, 73 of the total vote was polled in just 6 hours. Edmonton Journal headlines state, "Social Credit gets early lead in rural polls." The UFA government conceded defeat at 10 p.m. The final tabulation gave Social Credit 56 of the 63 seats. There was widespread jubilation, and the victory received front-page coverage around the world. To put an end to foreclosures on homes and property, early legislation was brought in which gave protection during the worst Depression years. A debt adjustment board created pursuant to the Reduction and Settlement of Debts Act in 1936 provided equitable adjustment of thousands of debts. Public debt was put to a stop with the implementation of a pay-as-you-go policy. Another measure to help the hard-pressed citizens of the province was the creation of prosperity certificates under the Prosperity Certificates Act of 1936. These injected a maximum of $2 million into the Alberta economy and were issued to any person willing to accept the same. in payment for any goods or services in respect of any public works on any level of government. Although the Act provided for denominations of 25 cents, $1, and $5, only the $1 ones were distributed. 1-cent stamps were to be affixed to the back of the certificates each Saturday. This encouraged the spending of them through the week. After 2 years, they could be redeemed by the bearer for face value. Other major legislation unique in combating the effects of the economic depression was the establishment in Alberta of the Alberta Treasury branches in 1938. The first branch was opened on September 9, 1938, in Rocky Mountain House, in a part of the Forestry Building. MLA Alf Hook represented the government. Mr. Lou Hurd, later MLA for Edmonton, was the first manager. The system of Treasury branches provided financial services at a reduced cost and brought these and other government services to rural areas where there were none. They provided a means through which the government could stimulate development of Alberta industries, including agriculture, and they provided the competition that brought about a relaxation of credit restrictions and reduced interest rates at other financial institutions. Over the years, many branches were built, and many agencies opened operating from these branches. Today, the Alberta Treasury branch goes under the name ATB Financial. With the Treasury branches came the issuance of the Non-Negotiable Transfer Voucher in 1939, which was devised as a means to promote the sale of Alberta-made goods. Account holders would have their accounts credited each month with 3% of 3 times the amount spent on an Alberta-made good, as recorded on their vouchers. Floyd and Stella Baker spent considerable time and energy traveling throughout the province to promote the motto, "What Alberta makes, makes Alberta." The work of the government was interrupted briefly for the 1940 election campaign. This was to be one of the most vicious campaigns ever to be fought by the Alberta Social Credit League. The Liberals and Conservatives joined forces in a concerted effort to oust social credit, targeting Mr. Eberhard in particular. Of course, Mr. Eberhard again went on the radio. What he had to say was very enlightening and could well apply to the present. Let's take a few minutes to listen.
For the next 15 minutes, you will hear Premier William Eberhard speaking under the auspices of the Social Credit League, which engaged time for this broadcast. Premier Eberhard.
Good evening, everyone. Yesterday was nomination day, and the result was most enlightening to all thinking men and women. 165 candidates were nominated for the provincial election. 165 candidates for 57 seats in the legislature. Whereas in 1935 there were 240 contestants for 63 seats in the legislature, a decrease of 20%. Three-way fights will take place in most of the ridings. That's most enlightening also. Let us pause for a moment to analyze just what these two great facts mean. They mean, as you well know, that the issue here in Alberta has narrowed down to 3 principal factors. To deal with the least first, let us take the CCF. You will have your chance on election day to say whether or not you want this province socialized. That is the great plank of the CCF. Private ownership and private enterprise is to be done away with under the CCF. You will have an opportunity, for instance, to say whether or not you think the province should be launched upon a regime which would seek to buy at your expense all the oil wells in the province, or confiscate them, as an alternative for the present setup in which, without expense to you and without any risk whatsoever, you can continue to control production through your government for your own use and in addition collect your rentals and royalties, which relieve your tax burdens considerably. You all should know by this time that what the CCF is offering is utterly impossible, because both purchase and confiscation of industry are entirely out of the question. First, because the CCF could never get the money for the purchase, and secondly, because confiscation would never be tolerated in this British country. So we can dismiss the CCF program as quite out of the question as a provincial issue. Now let us look at the real revelation of nomination day. It is the thing that must impress every voter with the truth about the fundamental issue in this election. As one newspaper put it, the amalgamation of liberals, conservatives, and others in opposition to social credit was the chief reason for the decrease in the number of candidates seeking election. Men and women, you all know that this union of the old line parties here in Alberta is not sincere, that those who are running as independents are not honestly independents. They're merely acting as independents for a time and for a definite purpose. You know that the same old party machines are at work to elect these candidates, and you know they have put forward only one reason why you should vote for them. They've offered you no program, no constructive proposals, and their one cry is defeat Aberhart and restore the credit of Alberta. That slogan is a political trick because the so-called credit of Alberta, the kind of credit they seek to restore, was ruined long before the social credit government ever took office. You surely have not forgotten that fact. You all know that the bonds of this province, away back before 1935, could not find markets except at a cost of from 6 to 7%. You all know that the big investing companies and corporations had long since stopped investing in farm properties before 1935. You know that farm credit had long since virtually ceased to exist before the social credit government took office. You farmers know that the fountain of bankers' credit had been denied you for years before you elected your social credit government to office. That is the sort of credit your liberal and conservative candidates, under the guise of independence, would restore to Alberta. Think of it. The doubtful privilege of boring you into more debt at 6 and 7%, and the monopolistic right to deny primary producers and individual industry of any credit whatsoever except according to the dictates of the money moguls of St. James Street. You cannot be fooled by any such balderdash as that. Tonight's Calgary Herald, that great clarion of the money barons' cause, says I refuse to debate the immediate issues with the Committee of 10,000. I did so, as the reprint of my letter on the front page shows, because I don't believe that committee of 10,000 amounts to a hill of beans. It was never a committee of 10,000, and you all know that. But when the chairman of that committee, the man who signed the letter challenging me to a debate, was a man who resigned his commission on the eve of his battalion's departure for overseas, I paid less attention to it than I might have done had it been signed by a man who acquired the reputation of finishing what he had started. Let me tell you, my friends, you farmers, you men and women who are engaged in small businesses and in private enterprise, let me tell you that you enjoy a greater flow of so-called bankers' credit now than you ever did during the period from 1930 until 1935, because the bankers now realize that if they ever hope to regain the upper hand in Alberta, they must loosen up with a little cash. They must coddle you back into a more friendly attitude, and they must win your goodwill. They're doing this because with the Aberhart government in power, they know that they will never be permitted to resort to the strong arm methods they used back in 1932. But let the money power regain control in Alberta, my friends, and you'll have a taste of the kind of credit they'll give you. They will demand and get their pound of flesh. They've already threatened it. The corporation taxes we placed on them, because they and not the people were in the best position to pay, will be gone with the wind, and that burden will be shifted to the shoulders of farmers, workers, small businesses, and small private industries. That is the kind of credit these fellows want to restore to Alberta. Very wonderful, is it not, if you bite on it? Today you're hearing a lot about what a wonderful thing it would be to have the big financial interest investing money in Alberta so that homes could be built. How, I ask you, is such money invested? It is invested in mortgages. Between 1930 and 1935, yes, and since then too, the mortgage companies took an estimated average of $30 million a year out of this province in interest and principal payments, and refused to reinvest a nickel of it in farm loans where it was most needed. They refused to listen to the pleadings of our farmers in their distress. They refused to reduce interest rates and payments on principal in accordance with the ability of the people to pay during those years, when prices for farm products were at the lowest point in the history of the country. It was not until after your social credit government went into power that anything at all was done for you, that any steps were taken to compel the investing corporations to consider the ability of the people to pay. And even then, these corporations were not deprived of the right to collect from those who could pay. They continued to take millions of dollars out of this province every year. And although they go on doing this, they steadfastly refuse to reinvest at least a portion of the money they take out back into the province for the building of homes, the improvement of farms, or the development of public works. In fact, they have done everything possible to block our efforts to refund the public debt of the province. Now they raise the cry, restore Alberta's credit. How utterly ridiculous. Individual citizens engaged in business are enjoying more of that so-called credit now than they did before this government took office. And as for the government, well, it doesn't need that kind of credit. We're getting along quite nicely without it, without plunging you into more public debt. In fact, we're decreasing the public debt, which is now some $7.5 million less than we took office. So they intend to throw us back into the old debt scramble, eh? And when they cry restore Alberta's credit, what exactly do they mean? To whom do they want to restore it? You know as well as I do that they mean to restore it to the banks and lending corporations. Well, why not restore it to where it belongs? Why not restore it to the people? That's what we've been trying to do all the time, because that would be the right thing to do. When you go to a moneylender to borrow some money, you get the money only on his terms. He dictates the rules of the game. That, my friends, brings about financial bondage, the kind of thing that was wrecking the country before 1935. As I said at the beginning of this broadcast, you men and women will be given a chance to make a choice between reverting to the old methods and the financial stagnation which you knew before 1935, or continuing under conditions of equity which you now enjoy. Conditions under which those who can pay are unable to pay, but under which those in unfortunate circumstances are given the protection they need. There is another angle to this question, however, that I'd like to mention. It concerns the man or woman who does not have any immediate financial problem. To such fortunate persons, I would like to put this one thought. You may have no money troubles, but remember that your next-door neighbor may have many such worries. Remember that the farmers and small businessmen throughout this province are faced daily with problems arising from debt to banks and lending corporations. It will not injure you to support those policies which help these other people meet their difficulties. You do a splendid work when, for example, you subscribe to the Red Cross to help our soldiers overseas, although you yourself will never be injured in battle. You do not subscribe because you yourself may be wounded. You do it to help the other fellow, someone whom you have never known and will never know. If you are so fortunate as to be without financial difficulties, remember the men and women who do have them. And in this election, vote for those principles and policies which are helping them and which will be continued so long as the social credit government holds office. Now, there's one other thing I would like to mention in the few remaining moments at my disposal. You know that the old line parties are ganging up on your government to restore Alberta's credit, as they put it, and you all know the kind of credit they want to restore. But I want to take you back to 1935 for a moment to tell you of the choice the social credit government had to make. It was a most important decision on your behalf. When the financiers of the Dominion government refused to help us to refinance bonds which were falling due, we had to reach a decision which would be fair for the bondholders and for the people of this province. We decided to put first things first. We had to decide whether the people in our rural communities without health services were going to get doctors and nurses, or whether the financiers were going to get all their interest money. We had to decide whether our hospitals would be enlarged to meet the demands of suffering humanity, or whether the financial interests were to get their interest money. We had to decide whether it was more important to have better and more roads than to pay the full interest rates, which were completely out of line with the true value of borrowed money. We had to decide whether it was more important to our people to have our young people employed in industry or to go on paying for the financial mistakes of previous governments in this province. We had to decide whether your children would have better educational facilities or the money power would get their full pound of flesh. We had to decide whether your taxes would be spent for the benefit of 95% of the people or for the benefit of the 5% who make money out of the money, and the 5% who make money out of the debts that are saddled on the community at large. Well, my friends, we made that decision, and you well know what it was. What would you have done had you been in our places? Who, under the circumstances which now prevail, have any cause for complaint? If all men were willing and eager to help their unfortunate brethren, there would be no complaint at all. Indeed, many of the 5% are not complaining. They've been broad-minded enough and intelligent enough to see that they should not claim their cash at the expense of so much suffering and privation among those less fortunate than themselves. They have accepted their reduced interest rates like good fellows, good sports. They have proven themselves to be good citizens in every sense of the word. But if a few of that 5% have refused to accept the money placed in the bank to pay them the reduced rates, these few of the 5%, ladies and gentlemen, are the only ones who really want to see the credit of Alberta restored to the state it was in before 1935. These few alone are responsible for the unholy union of liberals and conservatives in this election. These few alone will you serve if you vote for independent candidate on election day. These few of that 5% are out to get your vote in any possible way and on any possible pretext. In fact, they're out to cheat you if you're not well educated. They would hoodwink you if, because of unfortunate circumstances, you've not had a good schooling in English. They've been caught telling you to mark your ballots with a circle when they found out that you were going to vote for social credit. These few of the 5% whom I mentioned are seeking to build up in your minds excuses, not why you should vote for their candidates, mark you, but why you should vote against social credit. They don't really care for whom you vote so long as you vote against social credit, because if they can get you to vote against social credit for any reason at all, they'll be getting you to vote in the interest of the 5% rather than the interest of the 95% of our people. Do not be led astray by any of their nefarious tricks, my friends. Vote solidly for your social credit candidate and use only figures 1, 2, 3, and 4. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening.
For the past quarter of an hour, you have been listening to Premier William Eberhart speaking under the auspices of the Social Credit League, which engaged the time for this broadcast.
The results of the 1940 election gave Social Credit 36 independents, 19 liberals, and Labour won. World War I was now on. The Social Credit government continued to develop legislation to improve the living standard of Albertans in general, while planning for the return of the veterans when the war would be over. But the heavy workload and the undercutting of Premier Eberhart by opposition forces took its toll. His health became seriously affected, and he died on May 23, 1943. Following Mr. Eberhart's death, the caucus chose Mr. Manning to succeed him, to complete the term of the 1944 election. Mr. Ernest Manning remained as leader and premier until his retirement in 1968. Mr. Manning was succeeded by Premier Harry Strom following a leadership convention on December 4th and 5th, 1968. Following the defeat of the government in 1971 on the basis of the PC Now campaign, Mr. Strom remained on as leader of the opposition until 1973 when he retired. He died on October 2nd, 1984. It is worth noting that in the 1971 election, although Social Credit won only 25 seats compared to the PC's 49, the differences in popular vote was only 4.5%, 41.9 versus 46.4. Over the years, annual conventions held by the League played an important part in the formation of government policy. Here we see a picture of the delegates to the 24th Annual Convention in 1958. Roads went from this to this under a pay-as-you-go system of road building and maintenance, which created a network of debt-free roads, including bridges and overpasses. Up to 1966, there were a total of 71 senior citizens' lodges built in both rural and urban centers. Progressive legislation encouraged oil and gas exploration by the private sector, at the same time giving the province more than fair returns in royalties and lease sales. The famous Leduc No. 1, which came in on March 17, 1947, signaled a new era in the life of the province. The Great Canadian Oil Sands plant at Fort McMurray was the first ever commercial development of the tar sands. Shares of the value of $100 were sold to the public. The Northern Alberta Resources Railway was completed in 1970, providing needed heavy transportation for mining and bringing grain out of the Northwest. Healthcare coverage and facilities were second to none. Of major construction between 1963 and 66 were the Foothills Hospital in Calgary, the nurses' residence, and the W.W. Cross Cancer Center in Edmonton. Two major institutes of technology were established, one each in Calgary and Edmonton, which have met an ever-increasing need for business, industry, health services, construction, and other fields. University facilities were expanded in Edmonton and extended to Calgary, Lethbridge, and Grand Prairie. Numerous agricultural programs were instituted, including animal, poultry, and plant industries, veterinary services, agricultural colleges, loans to farmers, and many, many more. Alberta government telephones provided modernized telecommunications to all Albertans, from buried cable to microwave towers, which in 1969 allowed for cable television. To conclude this portrayal of the extensive period of good government under social credit, we bring you to a brief resume of achievements from a major speech given by Premier Ernest Manning during his last campaign in 1967.
The first of our objectives has been the development of Alberta's total physical and human resources. You are well aware, especially you pioneers, that we started from the position of economic stagnation and financial bankruptcy that existed in this province when your social credit government was first elected way back in 1935. Since that time, in the pursuit of this first objective that I've mentioned, Alberta has chalked up a record of achievement That is something of which all Albertans, without regard to their party politics, can be justly proud. We now enjoy the most buoyant provincial economy of any province in Canada. Our social services are among the best in the entire nation. We have more paved roads and all-weather roads in Alberta than any other province in Canada except Ontario. But there is this one important difference: all of ours are paid for. You're all familiar with our senior citizens' homes, our nursing homes, our auxiliary and active treatment hospitals, the extensive educational facilities that we have in this province. You young people are aware of the recently established Department of Youth, the Youth Service Corps that is being set up to challenge our young people to share in meeting the demands of the future. In the last session of our legislature, Alberta became the first jurisdiction in North America to provide the office of an ombudsman to protect more fully the individual rights of our citizens. We have, I suggest to you, an enviable record of achievement in this province, of which no Albertan need to be ashamed. We are now placing, and I think you'll agree rightly so, new and greater emphasis on the development of both our physical and human resources as we make our plans for the future. This is the central theme of the government white paper that was tabled at the last session of the legislature, and which is recognized already across Canada as the most advanced, the best prepared, best researched, a program of this kind that has been produced by any province in this country. I remind you listening tonight that when you are told that Alberta's government is out of touch with the times, the people who say this are completely unaware of the extent to which our research and the planning, the development of new concepts and value judgments for the future already embodied in our white paper has again set this province in the forefront of all provinces of Canada in advanced thinking in these important fields. I want to touch for a moment on the matter of the development of our physical resources. Our conviction is that the reason for developing physical resources is to improve the standard of living of all of the people of the province. Our physical resources basically fall into two big categories. Our agricultural resources, which have been the basic industry of this province since its inception, and then our mineral resources, which in recent years have occupied a most prominent position. I realize that you're being told by the opposition parties to your government that we have neglected agriculture as our basic industry. And they argue that we're spending only about 1.7% of our provincial budget on agriculture. I point out to you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a very misleading figure. It is true that you arrive at this figure if you take the appropriations for the Department of Agriculture alone and divide them into the total expenditures of the province. But what these people fail to point out to you is that there are many other departments of government in which provision is made for assistance to our agricultural communities, which do not appear in the Department of Agricultural estimates at all. For example, in the matter of local and district roads, surely these are of tremendous importance to our farming community. We are spending last year and this year over $36.75 million on local and district roads alone. But this expenditure appears in the Department of Highways, not in the Department of Agriculture. In the matter of rural electrification, which is of tremendous importance to our farmers, we have advanced to date over $51 million to assist our rural electrification cooperatives. But this doesn't appear in the Department of Agriculture estimates. because this matter is looked after in the Department of Industry and Development. All farm communities are concerned about better rural communication systems, rural telephones. Last year and this year we are spending over $20.5 million to improve rural telephone facilities. None of this appears in the appropriations of the Department of Agriculture, because this service is provided by Alberta government telephones. If you are going to take a fair picture or get a fair picture of what your government is doing in the interests of our basic industry, you must take not only the Department of Agriculture expenditures, but the expenditures in these other departments of government which relate directly to the benefit of our agriculture and rural communities. Let me turn now to the matter of the government's handling of the development of our other great natural resources, particularly in the field of oil and gas. There are political parties in this province who have been telling you that your government has given away or sold out your oil and gas resources to foreign owners, and that we are not getting a fair share of returns from the development of these resources for the people of this province. Ladies and gentlemen, such statements have absolutely no foundation in fact. I want to emphasize to you that in all the years that we have administered your public affairs, we have never at any time transferred the ownership, the title of ownership, of any of your oil or gas resources to any company, either domestic or foreign. All of our development in this province of oil and gas has taken place under lease agreements, with the title of ownership remaining with the government on behalf of you, the people of the province, that we might retain complete and effective control over the development of these resources, whether they're developed by domestic companies or by foreign companies. They tell you that we haven't received a fair share of the returns from this development for you, the people. I call your attention to the fact that we get our revenue from the development of these resources from three sources. First, from rentals charged on all land taken under exploration and development. Secondly, from royalties charged on the gross production of all of our oil and gas wells. And thirdly, the cash bonuses that are paid when the development leases are put up for development by public tender. When you combine the revenue that we have received from these three sources, you find that we have collected for you, the people of Alberta, a greater return from the development of oil and gas resources in Alberta than has been realized by any other jurisdiction in any other oil-producing area of the world. In the past 20 years, since the Leduc oil field was discovered in 1947, we have collected from these three sources over $2.25 billion. That works out at $1,500 for every man, woman, and child in Alberta, or $6,000 for every family in Alberta over the 20-year period. If you want to break it down a little more, that works out at $300 a year for every family for the past 20 years. Now, of course, it's purely coincidental that $300 a year works out at exactly $25 a month. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the development of your tar sands. You have been told by NDP spokesmen that your government has given a monopoly of the oil sands of Alberta to Great Canadian Oil Company Limited, and that all we're getting for you in return is 25 cents an acre on the land that has been turned over to the company. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you the facts. What about this matter of monopoly? There is in Alberta a total area of 7,810,000 acres of tar sands. The Great Canadian Oils Limited obtained one lease from the Sun Oil Company consisting of only 4,522 acres, which is 0.06% of the total oil sands area. I leave it to you to decide whether or not this is a monopoly. In all, there are over 116 leases and permits in the tar sands area. These are held by over 30 different companies. But the total amount covered by permit or lease is only 46% of the total tar sand area, which leaves 54% of our tar sands which have not been leased to anyone. So much for the argument about monopoly. Now, what about the returns to the people of the province? In the first place, the government, as soon as the plant goes into operation, will receive a rental of not 25 cents, but of $1 per acre per year. There is a 25% holding fee during that is 25 cents an acre holding fee, until such time as the lease actually comes under development. Then the rental goes to $1 an acre. In addition, the royalty, gross royalty on the production of the oil sands, will range from a minimum of 8% up to a maximum of 20%, or 1/5 of the gross production of the plant. This means that from this one plant alone, developing only 4,522 acres of tar sands, we will be receiving, once the plant is in full production, from rentals, from royalties, from municipal taxation on the plant and the equipment, and corporation tax charged on the same operation, over $5.5 million a year for every year that the plant remains in operation. And this, ladies and gentlemen, works out at about $1,200 per acre per year, as long as the operation continues. I think you will agree that this is a far cry from the matter of getting only 25 cents an acre for the people of this province, as is being peddled to you by NDP spokesmen during this present election campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been our firm policy, and will continue to be our firm policy, to insist that in the development of any and all of our mineral resources, first, that the title of ownership remain with the government on your behalf, and secondly, that we will always get for you a fair and generous share of the returns that accrue from the development of these resources. But let me turn now to the other, even more important resource that I've already mentioned. Our concern, particularly at the present time, is with the total development of the human resources of Alberta. I think you'll agree, in the early period of any country or province, it's understandable that the emphasis be on the development of physical things. But as the economy becomes established and the physical resources development gets underway, it is right and proper that a greater emphasis should be placed on the maximum development of the individuals who make up our society. And this is what we are emphasizing in the white paper to which I already have made reference. One of the first things we've spelled out in this regard in the white paper is a policy decision with respect to the form of society that we should accept as our goal. And we pointed out that there are two approaches to this problem. There is the socialistic approach that believes that society should be planned by the state, that professional planners should decide what is the best kind of society in which a people should live. And having decided at state level what kind of a society we want, the socialist planner then proceeds to develop all government plans and programs and policies to force the citizens to conform with those things necessary to produce the kind of society that the state has decided is the society in which the people should live. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we completely disagree with that approach. We maintain that the responsibility of the state should be to help the individual citizen develop his own potential, his own talents and abilities and aspirations and hopes along whatever line he himself wishes to develop. In other words, the state should limit itself to affording each individual citizen the maximum opportunity for the greatest personal development. And then let us accept as our ideal form of society the kind of free and creative society that comes out of free and creative individual citizens exercising their own initiative to develop themselves and their own potentials as they wish to develop, and not in conformity with some plan set down by the state and prescribed by the state planners. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that the vast majority of you subscribe to this latter philosophy that I've just outlined. And so in the matter of providing the maximum opportunity to our people, especially our younger people, to develop themselves in keeping with their own hopes and aspirations, we have given particular attention in this province to the provision of adequate educational facilities. And we are now spending in Alberta on the education of our young people more money per capita than any other province in Canada. This year, in public and high school expenditures alone, the people of Alberta will be spending $220 million. Another $9 million for our technical institutes. Another $1,600,000 for our junior colleges. Another $42,400,000 for our universities, or a total of $273 million in public, high school, technical, and university education for the young people of this province. And in addition to that, we are providing this year $49 million of new capital expenditures to increase the facilities. And we have committed ourselves as a government to a $175 million capital program for university construction alone, spread over the next 5 years. Ladies and gentlemen, we in this province are doing more to ensure our young people with the educational facilities necessary for the maximum development of their individual potential. May I point out that the $220 million being spent on public and high school education this year is an increase of $30 million over last year. And of this increase, $21 million is being picked up by the provincial Treasury, leaving only $9 million to be raised from other sources. Of the total of $220 million, we are paying from the public revenues of this province $121 million. In other words, your provincial government is carrying in Alberta one of the highest shares of the cost of education of any jurisdiction in Canada. Some of you may have seen the very interesting publication called Financing Education in Canada that was put out early this year by the Canadian Teachers Federation. Now, this isn't a government publication. This is put out by a research group of the teachers of Canada themselves. And in the interesting data that this booklet contains is a table showing the change in the percentage distribution of school revenue by provinces across Canada. That is the distribution as between local taxation and grants out of provincial revenue. And it's interesting that in the case of Alberta, between the years 1954 and 63, the local taxation, that is the share of the cost of education that it carried, decreased by 16.9%, while the share of the cost of education borne by the provincial government increased by 18.3%. Now, in the great province of Ontario, with its conservative government, local taxation decreased by only 11.3%, and provincial assistance increased by only 6.5%. In Manitoba, local taxation decreased by only 8%, provincial assistance increased by only 9.5%. And yet in Alberta, the province that some of these people are so fond of criticizing, the percentage borne by local taxation decreased by 16.9%, and the provincial share increased by 18.3%. I think these figures indicate, ladies and gentlemen, that your government in this province is doing and is determined to do everything in its capacity and power, not only to provide adequate educational facilities for our young people, to afford them the maximum opportunity for personal development, but we are carrying from the public revenues of this province one of the highest shares of the cost of education of any jurisdiction in Canada. We have also in Alberta, when we complete the present program of enlargement at the Southern Alberta Technical Institute, we will then have the two largest technical institutes in this country to provide for young people who want technical training instead of university training an opportunity to get the training that they require. This will enable them to adapt to the age of technological progress and change that we are entering in this country at the present time. Over and above this, we now have some 24 community development projects in which we're endeavoring to assist our people of Indian ancestry and those in communities that have not had as great opportunities as others in the past to develop themselves, to develop economically, to develop from a standpoint of education and community improvement. And in addition, I've already mentioned our new Department of Youth that is striving to assure the maximum opportunities to the young people of this province for leadership development, cultural development, and all other types of advancement of this kind. I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, our first great objective is the total development of the physical and the human resources of Alberta, and I suggest the information I've given you shows that we are well on our way as a leading province in Canada in this all-important development. I come now to our second objective, the establishment and maintenance in Alberta of a sound and free economy. Here again, we have adopted the philosophy that if we're going to develop our human resources, we must have in the province a sound economy and a free economy. By a free economy, I mean an economy in which individuals and groups of individuals are free to develop any kind of economic enterprise which they themselves are prepared to assume, keeping the government out of the field of business, keeping the government from interfering with the operation of individuals and companies in the economic activities and economic development of the province. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are those today who argue very strongly for individual freedom, especially intellectual freedom. I agree with them. I think intellectual freedom is one of the basic freedoms that we must always fight to preserve. But I'm a little disturbed sometimes when I hear doctrinaire socialists arguing vehemently on the one hand for individual intellectual freedom, and then turning around on the other hand and arguing that the state should regiment and control and even get physically into the business of operating the economic factors that make up our economy. I think we have to be consistent. Certainly we want intellectual freedom. Certainly we want individual freedom in the intellectual sphere. But surely it is equally as sound to afford to individual citizens and groups of citizens economic freedom to enter whatever business they wish to enter, to develop it along their own lines without government regimentation and without the constant threat of government stepping in and taking over the ownership of their enterprise after they have once made it successful. But in this matter of establishing a sound and free economy, there are some other points of vital importance. One of the most serious is the matter of the constant efforts that we are making and that must continue to be made to remove the abuses that are still inherent in our free enterprise economy. I mean by that, we must never cease until we eliminate from our free enterprise economy anything that grants special privileges to favored groups and yet denies other groups or individuals comparable opportunities for them to develop the economic area in which they are interested and concerned within the economy as a whole. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of the great fallacies that has been advanced in recent years by socialists is the fallacious argument that the only people who are interested in human values and the human component of society are the socialists or the collectivists. And they give the impression that everybody that believes in individual enterprise, an individual responsibility, an individual economic freedom, that believes in free enterprise in the economy, they give the false impression that these people are disinterested in the human component.
Drought again devastated much of the farm and ranch land of Alberta in 1984. In southern Alberta, with the summer being the hottest and driest in years. In southern Alberta, with the summer being the hottest and driest in years. Even normally reliable water holes completely dried up. Water had to be hauled for cattle, and even then farmers were forced to sell most of their herds because of a lack of pasture. Even normally reliable water holes completely dried up. Water had to be hauled for cattle, and even then farmers were forced to sell most of their herds because of a lack of pasture. It was the longest stretch without rain since the drought of the dirty 30s. There was a repeat of drifting soil and dust storms. Agricultural Canada's Lethbridge Research Station reported that grasshoppers had become a growing problem in southern Alberta cities due to the grain crops drying up and being cut because of the drought. Grasshoppers were moving into towns in search of food. Alberta Agriculture reported on August 9, 1984, that the hot, dry summer had sparked a province-wide bug boom, with the south being hardest hit, as a combination of drought and grasshoppers leveled crops. Farmers had sprayed in the neighborhood of 1 million acres in an attempt to control the grasshopper hordes. The prospects for 1985 were grim. To make matters worse, hail damaged crops in areas where drought and grasshoppers were not such a threat. In the 1930s, there were three crucial economic problems facing the farmers. Number one, the low price of farm products. Number two, the high cost of operation. Number three, the burden of mortgages and indebtedness. The same circumstances exist today. Farm foreclosure numbers in 1984 were unreal. The Alberta Farm Organization Unifarm demanded a one-year delay of farm foreclosures in June of 1984 and an immediate return of interest shielding loans. In the meantime, the Farm Survivalist Organization was blocking foreclosures and seizures. And then there is the food bank, which is today's answer to the soup kitchen. The growing demand, to quote the Edmonton Journal, is staggering. We are still a province of plenty, as we were in the 30s, but not everybody has access to that plenty. It seems that Mr. Aberhart's prediction has come true.